Welcome to another episode of Transformer CEOs. This week it was great to be joined by Chris de Bruin, CEO at Avenda, the large Australian life business. Chris is a serial CEO, having transformed a number of businesses and recently started his current role in Sydney. He's also a strategic thinker and problem solver. And among his key messages were, deep thoughtfulness is required by all CEOs to judge timing, what to change and what not to change, how to develop as a master of influence, successfully managing multiple stakeholders. If you think it's about control, forget it. Get the right talent on the bus and the wrong off the bus. Decide quickly, don't wait, then implement planfully and always with dignity. In addition to Transformer CEOs, I run a successful advisory and consulting company working with CEOs, chairmen and investors to deliver successful business transformations. I believe you're going to enjoy this episode with Chris, and please remember to leave comments because here at Transformer CEOs, we love your feedback. So Chris, you've worked in 7 countries, speak 3 languages, are known as a luminary, and are a serial transformer CEO. So as you go to your next gig in Australia, and congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
What do you not have in your bag?
Well, the wonderful thing about having done it a few times now is you move on to your next thing with a level of confidence that perhaps you didn't have. But what keeps driving you forward is there's always something new, something unusual to pursue and to learn. And in this case, I'm stepping away from what I've done for a while now, which is technology in banking. Mm-hmm. Now starting to think about how we might transform the insurance market, which remains, as seen from a modern transformational dynamic, insurance is still quite far behind other industries in terms of its level of digitization, its level of automation, and there's some structural challenges. But the biggest driver is really the social good that life insurance and retirement products represent for the average punter. And the belief is that the market is underserving its consumers, mm-hmm. and the products are not good enough. So that's an interesting challenge for me.
Interesting. So a more of an ethical purpose necessarily than a transformational purpose this time?
Ethical, yes, always. Mm-hmm. But more than that is, are you fit for purpose to serve those consumers and meet the needs that they have? So in that case, we can talk about the structure of Australian financial services, but it is an interesting curiosity. But the net result is everybody would agree. The politicians, the regulators, the customers, and the providers in the industry that a better job can be done. And the company that will win is the one that does the best job. From where we are now, moves most quickly, transforms most fundamentally, and drives a different way of thinking in the marketplace.
Fascinating. So we'll come back to mandate maybe a little bit later in our conversation, but I want to stick with the CEO-ship for a little while. So a lot of people say difficult to get, even tougher to keep. What's the motivation for the top job?
The motivation is very simple at the end of the day, is to do dramatic transformation. It's as much art as it is science. And artistry is not democracy. Artistry is about harnessing creativity, skills, talents, and then having the ability to paint the canvas. Mm-hmm. And so to be in the top job gives you, what's attractive to me is it gives you the opportunity to define not just what's on the canvas, the size of the canvas, where you're going to hang the canvas, what are you trying to achieve, and write the narrative in the most fundamental and profound way. Mm-hmm. And so the CEO job is, I think, the ultimate influencer job. You have to keep your board on side. You have to keep your shareholders on side. You have to keep your staff on side. You've got to keep your leadership moving. And ultimately, you have to do something that's valuable for customers. Otherwise, you're out of a job. So how do you keep it is you do all those things. And it's a 360-degree thing that you do. You don't have that single point of focus. And in many ways, a CEO job is the least empowered job, but it's the most influential job. You have so much, you have to just get all the ducks in a row, get a lot of people and carry them forward. And so that part of what I love to do, because I love talking to people about things. I love experimenting, thinking about new things, presenting the evidence, learning what that's about, and then taking people along the journey with you by telling the stories, helping them understand the data, helping them interpret the data, giving them a voice. And if you do transformation well, everybody feels that they've inputted into the final product. But you as a CEO are the final assembler of all those positions, and that's what's really interesting and stimulating.
Fantastic. So I heard ultimate influencer and final assembler, I think. Was that right?
Correct.
I don't want to misquote you, but there's two very interesting expressions. But you also mentioned the stakeholders that you have to assemble or influence. And one, of course, is the chair or the board.
Yes.
So what did they see in Chris? Going back to your long list of qualities, what stood out for them in you for this assignment, would you say?
Oh, I think in the end, it's a question for them to answer. So with the risk of speaking for them, I think I'll bring a couple of things to the role. But it's equally important to say why I took the role. Because I'm working with people that I've known for a long time. So I know many people on the board. I know the chairman extremely well. We have a long relationship going back some way. And when I took the job, I didn't interview to get it. I interviewed the shareholders, the board members, the chairman, to understand whether we had an environment where there's a genuine intent to go on a journey together, and that they were up for it. So you ask lots and lots of questions. And I think my particular skill set that recommends me is not only do I have a lot of experience in the Australian market at a very senior level, being able to talk to the politicians and the regulators, and very familiar with that. I've also had some success. That also helps. And but equally, because we are now predominantly owned by Japanese owners, so the company will be a joint venture between a UK-based owner and a Japanese owner, but the Japanese owner bizarrely also owns the majority of the UK companies. So long-term, we're working with Japanese folks, and having spent the better part of 7 years in Korea and Japan earlier in my career makes the cultural distance smaller. And we're able to have a dialogue in a way that sometimes when a Western CEO who's not familiar with how Japanese decision-making works, is not familiar with operating in a Japanese context, that creates tension on process, takes tension on style.
Yes.
And we spent a lot of time feeling each other out. And could we get through the difficult conversations? Because they have to be got through. That's the challenge of the project. But remove all that other stuff that sucks out energy and creates crisis. And so we're doing really well at the moment. I find the shareholder represents extremely good. I've got a very, very good board, content-wise, exceptionally talented. But also, I think that authentic way they lean in makes it very easy to talk to them. We can put the issue on the table, and nobody's going, why is the issue on the table? We just go, it's an issue. Let's talk about it. Let's get on with it. Let's deal with it. And that, I think, is fundamental to good progress. You want to transform something, knowing where you start, agreeing where you start, being able to talk about the issues, and not starting with differences of fact, which I think is the sort of really tricky part of transforming big companies, and we're quite a big company, is everybody's got to agree where you are. And that, at least the stage that I'm in with everybody, is just reacquainting everybody with the mathematics and the finances of where we are. This is where we really are. Can we express it in numbers, not in opinions? Can we express it as factually as possible? So no adjectives, no adverbs, no riders, no codicils, just it's what it is. And the board I'm working with is extremely good in that environment. So that does help. And our owners are equally very keen to progress. And so if you talk to them about this is where we are as a step to getting where we want to go, as opposed to just a statement of, perhaps we don't like where we are, which is generally you wouldn't hire me if you liked where you are. So you have a conversation about we're in a tough spot. This is what it is. Understanding it helps us move to the next stage, which helps us move to the next stage. So in that sense, that sort of fact-based orientation, a sort of degree of brutal honesty exists in my environment. And that's very good for me. And that's why I've chosen the role. And I think that's why we ultimately will be successful. We're not carrying a lot of baggage forward.
So you sound very clear on the baseline. And it sounds like the dialogue you've been having has been as much about clarifying the mandate as it is clarifying the cultural interaction as well. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think most of it's about clarifying the current situation, starting point. That's really important. And there's some difficult conversations in there because that's understanding where you are in that sort of sense of brutal honesty is you thought this, but it's really this. And sometimes there's good news. In fact, I've been talking to my shareholders about you did a big project. You all seem to think it's a failure, but in reality, it's a success. Has it achieved 100% of its goals? No, it's achieved 80% of its goals. So in many ways, you start with what's all the good stuff we have that we can build on, where are our challenges, and try to bring a really balanced view in the conversation. That's been most of it. The second thing is then being very clear on where we want to go. Yeah. So before you map the journey, let's all be clear on what we're going to try to achieve, and then have a tough conversation with ourselves about whether that's achievable or not. So if you're in a low growth consolidating industry, you're not getting 20% growth per annum. So you have to face into that. That's not a lever that you can really pull. So correct. So we've done a lot of that readjusting by knowing this is where we are, this is what we got, this is what we don't have, this is where we'd like to be. Some of it's unrealistic in the short term. Some of it is somewhat conservative and we can probably do more. And we arrive at a strategy that is actionable and then you get started.
And I think for folks listening as well, having the confidence to do what you've done, arguably before you've even started, I think is going to be a huge learning for a lot of people. Really to have the guts and the confidence to go in and ask the tough questions, to get aligned, as you say, on fact and on style, just sets the first year or two off in a very different way.
Yeah, I think the part of understanding who you're in business with is really the important part. And you and I have done some work together with interesting stakeholders. And I think you understand what's possible is often based on who you're doing it with. Their ability to self-reflect, their ability to absorb the messages, their ability to, if it's an ownership group, give you what you need to do the transformation that they're asking for, and making sure that the two line up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, we'd love to be incredibly transformative, but you can't have any money kind of conversations that circulate. And you and I were in one.
Yep.
And then you have a different pathway, but start with who you're in business with. Who's in your environment, who the owners, who's the board, who the executives, in the critical talent groups inside the company, who do you have? That's always where you need to start. If that's good, you can generally always get where you need to go because you have the human capital to drive the change. If you can get that right, then mapping the journey becomes easier. And the next step, I think, is then once you've got the right people, it becomes easier to have the conversation. If you find the conversations are really hard in terms of establishing a fact base, then you've got problems.
Bit of a warning sign.
It's the biggest warning sign. Yep. You come into a meeting and there are two views on the same number. So then you start with differences of fact. Then someone's defending something or someone's got an agenda. And most often when you have companies that require some form of transformation, it's because their performance is slightly less than people want. And often the case is you're defending suboptimal, subpar performance or solutions that have come to the state. So very big corporations, you advance by having an unblemished track record of success. This is a somewhat false narrative for any executive. If you're not making mistakes, you aren't really pushing the envelope, you aren't really driving change. But then you have people defending these stellar records and then you go, so did everything work? Because if you aren't prepared to look at your flaws or the mistakes or the under delivery, the system only does 70% of what you say it does, then you're starting in the wrong place because first you have to fix the 30% that doesn't exist. And then everybody's going, well, where's all the money going? Because it's supposed to be at 100. You go, no, but it's really at 70. And then I have to fix the 30 first so that I can then move forward. So I'm not moving forward yet. And so that baseline becomes critical. But if you will have the wrong people to make a transformation.
We'll come on to that because that's a huge topic.
So if you can't get the baseline established, the first place you should look is, do we have the right environment, people, players?
So you used the term a moment ago, stellar track record. So I want to talk about your stellar track record for a minute. And I'm curious about where the CEO-ship idea begins. So, was it at primary school or high school where the teacher says, what are you going to do when you grow up? Or was it something an epiphany later in life that said, this is the role for me? What was the
I think I still don't think of myself as a CEO.
Okay.
Although I've done, I've been a president, a CEO, now I'm a group CEO of 4 different companies. But the drive to that really starts with what I'm most interested in, which is solving problems. So, I was a scientist by training, solving problems in the pharma industry, went to business school, did well purely because I solve problems as well as anyone. And then, a really successful stretch at McKinsey, working with clients who inevitably always have problems. The idea that big consulting firms drive the bleeding edge of innovation is completely wrong. They generally are taking laggards to average or average to above average. So you're spending a lot of time with people, clients, saying you could be a little bit better. That's the point about benchmarking. Well, you sort of aren't as lean as you could be. You aren't going as fast as you could be. So you're solving problems all the time. And my major epiphany was when I got offered partnership at McKinsey, I realized that the business of consulting was not the most interesting thing for me. Love the firm, love the culture, learned an incredible amount there, immensely grateful to my mentors there and still friends with all of them. But the problem solving was what's driving me. So as soon as I'm having to be in the business of generating consulting work, that was clear to me that wasn't the thing was going to get me out of bed in the morning. So then you solve the next problem, which for me was, banking's broken and maybe digital banking will be better than analog banking. And you do a digital bank. And then if you're really lucky, like I was, you get to sell it and make some money. And then particularly, I think that was in sort of 2003, then the problem for the world at that point was, how do you deal with the rise of China, the rise of Asia, the shift in trading patterns? And I was very fortunate that Standard Chartered bought my business and they were very Asia heavy, and that put me into Asia. And I went there because I really wanted to understand how the world is shifting.
Great. So let's build on that stellar track record, so that you've explained the origins very clearly. What about the setbacks? Because as you said a moment ago, if it all looks stellar, it's maybe not trying hard enough or pushing hard enough. So what were some of the setbacks that you would point to in your career?
I think you have many always. Sometimes you make a decision and in the long term it works out well for you. So leaving McKinsey was a fantastic decision for me, but I did a couple of, so 2020 Financial Services, which is the business I sold to Standard Chartered, was the third startup I did. So the first 2 didn't work.
Okay.
So you start them, you figure out it's a great idea in one case, but you've underestimated the market power of the incumbents and they just crush you. And you suddenly find, in that case where we'd raised $20 million to do the startup, we just gave it back to the shareholder. There was one primary shareholder. We said, this can change, but you should take these tools in-house because you can weaponize them for yourself, and the company's gone on to do really well. But it wasn't an entrepreneurial opportunity. Incumbency was too powerful.
Got it. And what was the impact of those setbacks on you as a problem solver?
I just learned to get smarter, right? I think particularly what you start to think about is market timing, which is really important. So a great idea, Airbnb as an example, is not the first version of Airbnb. There was one very similar business by Idea Lab 15 years previously, but the moment was wrong. And then equally for me, 2020 Financial Services, which we sold and we all made a fair amount of money, we would make 1,000 times as much money if we'd held it for 10 years. So we were in many ways too early. So we're trying to build a digital bank in a iPhone era. So you're using Symbian as the OS, you're using web protocols, and adoption of the internet. We were still in just post dial-up starting to get to. So you suddenly realize these things matter. If you go too early or you go too late, or you underestimate who your competition is, you underestimate how they're going to lean in, and you start doing a lot more game theory. You start going, if I do this, what happens? If I do this, what happens? How will they respond to this push? How will they respond to that push? And it modified how I think about things, which is transformation is not disruption. Innovation is not massive disruption. Sometimes the best path for an entrepreneur, for a business, is not to destroy the market you're in. So we see a lot of markets that you look around the world now, some driver of innovation has come and completely evaporated all the value in that marketplace. And so you've destroyed value for everybody, and you've arrived in a marketplace that you thought had 100 units of value, and now there are only 10 units of value, and you're the reason. And now you're competing for 10% of 10 as opposed to 10% of 100. And so you have to think much more fundamentally around the strategic ramifications of the industry, particularly with you in it, rather than as it is now. And then you're the vector that's going to disrupt it. You have to think about it. How does it look after you do this disruption? So you start becoming more practical, more thoughtful. Take a breath before you go. Not everything needs to be changed quickly. And often the most valuable business models is to gently innovate and undermine the legacy business models of big incumbents in a way that's very subtle, so that they don't feel the need to change, and you slowly accrue value, and then 10 years down the line, they look and they're irrelevant and you own the market. So you become, in that sense, much more thoughtful and much more subtle in how you do strategy. Just using digital as a disruption vector is not a strategy. It's just one part of your strategy.
That's wise words. What about, because you say you don't think of yourself as a CEO, but of course you are. And I guess at one point you made the step from, a senior leadership role into the top job. What's your advice for the generation that comes next making that transition? And what should they think about from a readiness point of view?
Yeah, I think there's two things that are really important, or possibly three, but the first two are really, you need to have some foundational quality, whether that's deep expertise in something. So I did a lot of work in banking, but I don't come from a banking background. I'm a biochemist. So everybody goes, how do you become one of the world's leading bankers by being a biochemist? You go, well, first of all, I'm really good at something, which is I absorb knowledge quickly, I read fast, I learn how to problem solve, but I can build expertise. And in the case, I started by building expertise in what we used to call alternative distribution. We'll call that digital distribution today. So you come into every conversation when people across the table from you go, why should I listen to this person? There is a leg that you stand on, which is, I have a bunch of expertise, right? If you have a track record, that also helps. And I think for the CEO, there's no doubt that the track record becomes massively important. So yes, they're knowledgeable. Yes, they're clever. But can they move things from A to B? And if you can move things from A to B, then you can be recommended for CEO. If you can't, then the bet is pretty large. So when people are interviewing you, understanding what they're trying to do, where they're trying to go, and giving them the confidence that not only do you understand the journey that they're on, but you've been able to navigate down that journey. Not necessarily as the CEO, but you understand how to walk the walk. And then I think the final thing, particularly if you're trying to become CEO of a company you're already in,
all right,
permission to lead becomes critical. So do the board trust you? Do the board agree with you on what you're going to try to do? And can you find that equation? And it's important that you find it, right? And there's two ways to go about it. You either align with the board, or you tell the board where you want and align them with you, but you can't go in different paths. That's never going to work. So you need permission from the governance layer, from the owners, but importantly from your peers. Your peers need to be prepared to follow you. So that's a more subtle thing to win. But do they trust you? Or do they feel safe with you? That's also true with the board. Do they feel safe with you? So can we deal with difficult things without this becoming personal, without me being personally at risk? Because the CEO needs the same. Can the CEO lean into the board without feeling attacked at all times? And I think that becomes, I'd say, the third thing. Harder to do if you're going outside the company and you're being appointed into a new role in a new company, but you need to be really curious and see, am I going into the right environment? My very strong recommendation is if you don't feel the alignment, you don't feel the support, and you don't see that openness for the dialogue, then you should go somewhere else and do something else.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So we're going to move on a little bit or maybe just around to talk, dare I say it, what you've transformed. But of course, you've talked a lot about some of your transformation journeys. I'm sure even with your career, there's probably one or two that stand out, though.
Yeah, I think when I was working with banks as a consultant at McKinsey, what always stood out for me was logically and obviously, there are levers that they could be pulling to make themselves substantially more competitive without shifting the market dynamic, without shifting their competitive position, they would just have more margin. And I never understood why they wouldn't do it. And it's one of the things that I still struggle to understand in companies is why leadership of companies is lazy on cost, and particularly lazy on deploying things that make time, cost, quality better, as sort of organizational effectiveness levers. These would seem somewhat obvious to do because they make you the best version of yourself. They don't change your market positioning, your market context, but put you in charge of the dialogue because you're the lowest cost producer. And so a large part that forms how I think about transformational dynamics is I couldn't understand that. So I went, well, I'm pretty sure that I can build a bank that operates at 1/10 of the costs of your traditional bank. And they went, no, it can't be done. And that sort of infuriated me because I felt it was obvious. I was probably arrogant at the time, but we then did build a business that operated at a fraction of the costs that normal retail banks operate at. And then you suddenly go, oh, we can win this game because they have to chase us. And so 2020 was foundational in so much that it proved that you can translate the logic, the consulting speak, the presentational pages into an operating footprint. I had a wonderful partner who was incredibly practical and creative in how we did things, and a great bunch of technologists. And I learned so much from them as sort of the junior partner in the venture, which is we can do what we set our minds to do if we build it in a very logical, fact-based way. And then suddenly you have this super, super lean way of doing something, which I think why it stands out for me, it's the first time you went from theory to practice. And just in 18 months, write it down, two people, in a garage with a whiteboard, literally, right, or in the back of the car. You go out and build it. And then you say, if I choose to do it, my intellect is enough, my drive is enough, if I have the right partners. And so then the critical part becomes, who do I do with? And that shapes how you think from then onwards. And then we weren't as successful as we could have been because we underestimated market context. We underestimated the value of partnerships. We probably raised too little money.
Okay.
We probably moved too quickly. We could have slowed down a little bit. We weren't conscious of threats, but still it was a definitive experience. And then I think the work with Stan Chart was lots of small innovations, which teaches you that innovation and transformation isn't always big bang. There's this notion of intensity. Can I do many, many small things fast, or I can do a few big things? And if you it helps me now with my Japanese owners, Kaizen is do lots of small things and do them often. Plan them well, do them often, keep going. This idea of continuous improvement. You actually get a lot further. And so the one that stood out there for me was when I arrived at Stan Chart, it didn't even have digital banking. And a coalition of the willing formed at the center of the bank with some amazing personalities, some people who are still good friends, and went, we want to be number one digital bank. And then what does that mean? How do we work on it? And over the period of 5 years, we went from nowhere to being the leading digital bank in 19 countries in our footprint. And why 19 countries is so important is because you just pushed the expertise to the periphery of the enterprise. So you weren't just best in Hong Kong, which is Stan Chart's biggest market, and then best in Singapore and best in India, you were best in Nigeria, best in Kenya. So you proved that the methodology and the techniques and the digital awareness, the way that the company runs, it works everywhere. And you get this real confidence that we can win in every market. And then we did some gimmicks and, took the app up to the top of Everest, which is, the digital team's, gimmick. But, it created awareness, which helped us. But building foundational capability became really important. And the one I've done most recently, the one that you were involved in, was take a company that's entirely analog end to end. And culturally is in love with that because we're special, writing books about ourselves, eulogizing our qualities in the marketplace. But when we scratch under the skin, it's literally paper and files and thousands of people moving those papers and files. And then the outcome is very poor because you underuse analytics, you underuse digital capability, there's no efficiency in the business. It's all based on a few smart people, which is also not sustainable.
And I don't think customers were raving.
Customers were not raving. And you sort of become a grudge purchase, if you will. And if you're there, you're in trouble because anybody that's more efficient than you, everybody uses data better than you, everybody that's more digital than you are, and anybody that has a greater relation with the customer than you have, they'll always win. You are you're just picking up the scraps in the marketplace, and particularly in a lending business, to have that type of negative select in your portfolio is very, very bad. You're always going to struggle. So that was the most interesting one, because we changed fundamentally how the culture worked. And that, I think, was the most interesting for me, because most of what I'd done before was really technical in nature. Great collaborators, a willingness to go, everybody on the journey with you pretty easily. And then, so what do we do technically? And this was one where you went, well, this company is not in trouble because the people aren't clever. Is they're choosing to eulogize a business model which is not fit for purpose, and then you have to move them. And in that case, we lost almost 2/3 of the executive and more than 50% of the staff to rebuild that culture in the right way, which was a different learning, but it really stands out because I probably learned more, and I suspect everybody that worked with us, including yourself, learned an incredible amount about changing how people think, changing how people perceive the world. And some of these people had known no other business model. This is the only place they'd worked. So that becomes more interesting, because as I do bigger and bigger changes, delivering the culture change is the way you get it to stick and make it sustainable. And so I had incidents in earlier years where we did transformational projects for clients, and then they would regress quite quickly. And it became, you had not established, and particularly the cultural foundations, to keep moving, to keep going. And so then ultimately the transformation is a success, but just for a millisecond, and then it starts to backslide almost immediately.
So is that the reason why, and we'll come on to more the Deem story, because I think there's rich pickings there, but it's widely cited that 70% of transformations are unsuccessful.
Unsuccessful in the long term, I think, which is really important. That often you can have great success in the project and you can hit all your measures. I think what I see in a lot of those that are in that 70% that people see as failing is you haven't addressed the foundational elements that lock it in place after you've moved it. So it naturally just slides back to where it was, because, and again, it's this sort of technical challenge versus the adaptive challenge. The technical challenge has become the major part of what everybody's doing. And actually, what I learned in the Deem story is if you change the culture, and there's many ways you can change it, but if you can lock it in, then it will continue for a very long time after you're gone, because it's the default of how the company works. And Deem continues to be very successful in the Middle East, which is very pleasing.
But I think what you did there, to your point, is you changed the muscle memory.
Yeah.
So instead of the elasticity back to the old world, it stayed where you left it, and I think has continued to.
Yeah, so I think we achieved something quite dramatic, that we severed the link to the past.
Yeah,
in a very aggressive way, including rebranding the company, changing the leadership, but we also changed fundamentally the technical underpinnings of the business, policies, procedures, technology, and that made a really big difference. And there's a lot of it was symbolism to create the mindset change, but a lot of it was hard wiring. You actually can't do anything else. And part of why I love digitizing businesses is because you can hardwire the new way into the business, so it's very, very hard to regress. If you leave it in an analog, humanistic way, people will go back to what people are most comfortable with, and you don't anchor them against something. So performance management systems are an example of how do you lock people into the new way of thinking by establishing a performance management system, which is different from the one they had before, and amplifies the things that you want and eliminates the things that you don't want.
That's great. And because we tend to think of transformation in quite a kind of logical way, but there's a big emotional side to transformation.
Yeah, I think it's almost all emotional.
There you go.
And that's sort of the learning. As I did more and more transformations, and you become frustrated, you learn two things. One is to stop at the very beginning and make an assessment, right? So don't be in a hurry. So one, do we need to change? Why do we need to change? Relative to our industry, relative to our competitors, relative to general market movements. Today we'd assess AI as an important market movement. You go back to 20 years and the emergence of the internet as the dominant information sharing capability in the world. It's almost inevitable you must move, but it's worth just taking the pause and going, if I need to change, why? What do we need to achieve? Assuming then you've got the right partners and collaborators, just take that pause to understand why we're doing it. Because if you can understand the why, it also becomes easier to convey that as a message to the people that you have to carry with you. So establish very clearly, yes, we need to do, this is why we need to do it. And then importantly, where do we want to go? Not in tight destination terms, but as a general target area, we need to be somewhere different. Then you can start. And then you have to deal with all of the emotion that comes with it. So my 2 lessons over a long period of time is just set up the preconditions really well. And then the second part, spend a lot of time on giving, not just helping people or giving them a good environment, but giving them actual work to do so that they are transforming through action. Okay. Give them things to do. Go on a culture journey where the company redefines its own culture in line with where you want to go. Lean into that curiously and authentically, but let them shape it. And then suddenly everybody's busy working productively, and there's less time for anxiety and also less need for anxiety because they're part of producing this new version of everything, and you can give them a lot of work to do. The coders will code, but a lot of people worry about the fact that I'll be left out of this, I won't have a role in this. But you put them to work in understanding how do we want to run this company? Who do we want to be? How do we want to talk to customers? And you give them a very active role in that. So it's less transformation through telling and a much more organic version of how we're going to do this. And then I think it makes the role of the CEO or the leader much more interesting because you're, in that sense, we often talk about plant a flag on the hill, or, and you guess, no, that's not what's happening. You're in a conversation with a very large group of people. And if you are open to it, they will shape a better version of the outcome than you would have by yourself, or you with your favorite consulting firm. But you get to shape it. You get to put limits on it. If it's drifting too far, of course, you get to put it back. But that collective energy is what long-term makes the change stick. So your technical answer may only be 80% of what you'd hoped for, but it's going to be solid, as opposed to, I might have 100 and I'll be back at 60 before I'm done. Then that 80 becomes the new baseline for the next generation of change.
Very clear. And you articulate that beautifully, Chris. Go a level deeper if you can. So take the Deem example. What were some of the from twos that you saw come out of that activity with the population?
Well, I think in terms of culture, the differences are quite stark. I think the first really important step that we took is to have an honest conversation about where everything is. And so we also had technically a good opportunity to do that because the implementation of an accounting standard in IFRS 19, we needed to do all those reassessments. And then you can be very clear with everybody that this is the real picture. At least financially, this is the real picture. This is how we're performing. These are our efficiency levels. These are our capital returns. And then you create a nice foundational picture. And it wasn't a great picture. It was quite worrisome. And the shareholders, as a result, then had great urgency to act. And that actually gave us a much stronger mandate to act more profoundly. Otherwise, we would have sort of evolved. In this case, we could say, let's just completely change the business model. So that'll be the first one. The second one is then thinking about, do you have the necessary talent to go to the next level, which is something you have to really invest in. So establishing, what do you think are the attributes of the leadership? What are the key skills that a team, to do what's on the cards now, what do they need to have? And then go very deep into their psychology, understand their primitive state, use all the tools that HR practitioners have available to them to tell you what's really going on with these folks. Because people are quite good during these interruptive periods in companies to protect themselves, and they hide behind facades, and you have to get past that and really understand that. And a good HR practitioner helps you get that done. The assessments help you get that done. And then you can just rank them against global standings and go, what do I have? It gives you a good foundational sense for, do I have the right kind of talent? Do they have the right kind of skills? So you do the assessments, and then you make a decision whether they can stay or not. But then you have to have a very clear plan on how I'm shifting my talent profile. And then get them bought in next, right? Don't waste a lot of energy on a team that you're not going to keep. Do that quite quickly. I think one of the failures of generally good leadership in companies is when leaders are kind to themselves and burn lots of time on money by not acting on weak leaders, toxic personalities, and so on. Make the decision quickly, because then it gives you lots of time and money to execute on the outcome. You may choose to execute quickly, you may choose to execute slowly. I've kept somebody that was very clearly a leaver for 9 months because they held critical information, did a critical job, and it was very hard to find a replacement, but made a decision really quickly. That gave us the 9 months to line up a new candidate that we could bring in. When that was done, we could then make the shift very conservatively. Others, the cost of having them around is painful, but you make the decision quickly. It means you can give them more money, you can give them more time, you can have an empathetic exit where you look after the person, because we may no longer want their labor and their talent, but we still want them to be treated well as a human being. So the company's duty of care remains. You look after them as you go. Quick decisions give you more economic resources to deliver on taking care of people. So then you let them go. And then the rest of the people, you're staying, commit or don't. If you commit, this is the journey we're on, let's get started. And then you invest all your time in getting those people there. But they need a lot of time. One is a bit of mourning. You have to mourn for the business that you thought was great that actually isn't. You have colleagues leaving, that's disruptive. You have to give time for people to accept that that's where it's going to go. Then there's a period of self-reflection and reassessment. Do I really want to stay? Am I really up for this? And sometimes that'll take you 2-3 months just to manage the team through that. And when you get there, you're ready to go. And in many ways, that feels like you're going slowly, but you're going slowly to go fast. Because once they're on board, you can motor, because then they really bought in. And so this feels like, for me, it's always frustrating. And I always give the rights to somebody like you, in the case where we work together, where you slow me down or speed me up because I'm always irritable because I want to go faster. But I also recognize that my instincts are wrong. I've learned that over time. I would go too fast and we'd break later. And so you learn to trust other people that go, have we got it right? Are we, and for me always it's bring in a very senior, very competent, been there, done that many times, HR senior, who will just sit alongside you and tell you when you're wrong. And say, speed up, slow down. No, that's wrong. You probably don't do this right. Maybe we haven't got the message right. Maybe we haven't structured the program right. But because those first 3 months, when you're doing it, if you get it right, long term, it's so much easier. And it's worth making that investment. But that's all about managing people's emotions, their sense of who they are, their sense of their position in the company, position in the industry, some of it's ego, some of it's fear. You just got to get people through that. And when they land on the other side, then you've got a real fighting chance.
Yeah, amazing. And I want to come back to some of the other levers in the organization that you can pull during a transformation. But just sticking with the talent point for a moment, have you seen over your career, is there some common DNA in the people that thrive in that moment of what looks like organized chaos? In a way, is there people you look for in the first 3 months, 3 years of a transformation?
Look, not 3 years. So let's get that out there. If you haven't finished your transformation in 3 years, it's not going to work. The ability for an organization to sustain focus on a particular transformation process, a particularly strategic piece, if you outside 2 years, the energy is going to dissipate.
I agree. People just get exhausted.
And you need a new narrative and you need freshness, and also the market moves around you. So they're always short. So the way I tend to think of it is this 3-month period at the beginning, which I call the long audition, right? Which is you're looking around the company. And you have to be incredibly curious, go down 2-3 levels in the organization, spend a lot of time talking to people and saying, what do you think needs to happen? And in many ways, the job of a new CEO like I am now is to catch up with the organization on things they already know to be true. And a large part of your credibility is bound up by, can you understand what's really going on in the organization? Can you see through the politics? Can you see through the gaming? Can you see through the facade? Particularly, can you see through the kiss up, kick down managers, which is always problematic for working level people. And when the company sees you lean in on things they already know to be true and you've caught up quickly, then suddenly you're a legitimate CEO. If you never catch up with it and you continue just to go with the flow and just plug yourself into the existing dynamics, you're never going to get any transformation done, and your best talent will continue to lead. So the first part is that really curious period of looking and who's prepared to speak up. So people I really value as I go through this process is people that are prepared to come to me and say, number one, here's stuff you don't know, because basically you're new and you're kind of dumb because you're new. And that's all in the sort of realm of specific knowledge, stuff you can't deduct because it's not logical. It just is because of the company is there and it works in a particular way historically. So people will come in and teach you. Those are hugely valuable because you know that they're committed. They want their colleagues to do well. They're leaning in. People will tell you the truth, right? Will say, you'll hear this, but it's really this. And then you go and verify that and you dig into it and you find that they're willing to speak up. And sometimes it's quite nuanced, but the more nuanced it is, the more valuable the person is, because their ability to find the nuance and articulate it means that they really know what's going on. And so they're not coming with blunt suggestions or people that, so everything's terrible. They're completely unhelpful. People go, this is good, this is not quite good. We talked about the technology example I used before. We've achieved 80% of the outcomes. It's not enough, but we've achieved 80% of the outcomes. So it's not that if somebody goes, oh, that's a terrible program, and you go, no. I need more nuance, right? So, that's the second category of people I really like. And then as you talk to people that are keen to move on, not in as in I want to go work somewhere else, but keen to, can we be better? Here's some thoughts. And they will come and find you, which is the wonderful thing about being the CEO is CEOs don't need to go and find a lot of people. A lot of people just find the CEO. And so being CEO is not a fair fight because there's a lot of them and one of you. But in this case, it really works for you because people come and talk to you. You just have to be available and open. So I sit on the floor. I don't sit in an office. I go to many places. I spend a lot of time sitting in the canteen talking to people. Just let them find you. And they'll tell you really interesting things. And those are the people you want, because generally non-hierarchical, keen for the company to do well, thoughtful about what's really going on, often have suggestions on how to fix it. And so you don't need to make up everything yourself. You don't have to find every answer yourself. Often it's just about liberating the best people and the best ideas in the company to move forward. So that's what I look for when I'm looking for people. And conversely, you're very clear who needs to go, because they're the opposite of those people, the people who won't tell you what's going on, frustrate you at every level, try to control information and don't want to share it with you, create alternative narratives which are unhelpful, compete with their colleagues. Those are things that you can see quite quickly. And I think the point of being restful and calm for 3 months is it's a long audition. It's quite hard to fake it for that long. And at the end of it, you sort of know where everybody is. Everybody sort of knows where you are and where you're going, and it helps people self-select. And the people that self-select in are generally the ones that are going to make you successful. And the ones that self-select out are not, in that sense, not talented people. Generally, they're often very talented people. They've brought the company to where it is, but they just don't have an interest in the next part of the journey. They would rather go and do something else. And I think that is a very successful outcome if you can help them on to their next exciting period. Because often they're just tired, working hard for 5 years in a difficult job, lose my sponsorship because the CEO is gone. I'm kind of done. I've been in that situation, and you go, well, I'll just go try something else now. And if the company will help you, that's hugely beneficial.
So we've talked a few things there about a lot around talent, or like how we might manage the change. You've also talked about cultural aspects, and you've started talking a little bit about your leadership as the CEO in a transformation. And I think you've said things like, be quite restful, be listening, be available. Continue that list for me. What are the other things that maybe, and particularly in that 3 month period you describe, where you've got to kind of handhold the organization from one side to the other? What are the other qualities that you recall in those moments?
Well, I think those are deeply important.
Yeah.
But I think I'd sort of step back and say the first thing that you have to do is, when you're the CEO, you have to come and be the CEO. So you have to find a way, and it can be gentle. It doesn't have to be, heads on spikes type of decision, but you have to start making decisions quite quickly that are meaningful. If you just snipe around the edges, you very quickly become an irrelevant CEO, and then you fail very quickly in these jobs. You don't always succeed. There's a healthy proportion of failure, but you don't want to fail quickly because you didn't demonstrate that you are the CEO. So you have to show up as the CEO. So in many cases, that means quickly understanding power alignments inside the company and breaking down the ones that are proxies for the CEO. Particularly if you inherit a company where the CEO has been hugely empowering for a long period of time, these power blocks exist, and you have to demonstrate your ability to break them. Because otherwise everybody goes, well, he's here, but he's not really the CEO. And sometimes that means you have to demonstrate your ability to manage the shareholder, manage the board, shift the context, because that's the thing only the CEO can do. I think also breaking up power aggregations that are dysfunctional is really important to do. So show up.
Yep.
It's not a shrill, loud, sometimes it's quiet, confident, but do the work. And then the point about being open and listening and being present, at least from my perspective, tells the organization that I'm not here to do it to them. I'm here to do it with them. I'm still the CEO though. And I think one of the mistakes that people make when they're in the CEO role for the first time is they're so busy telling everybody that they're the CEO, they forget to be the CEO. And there's many ways of telling, but a lot of it's those things that you do that signal that you're the boss. The fact you give yourself a big office, that you dominate meetings, you talk too much and so on. That's unhelpful in the early stages because you miss a lot. If you balance between talking and listening, the early part is listening. Listening to the marketplace, listening to the shareholders, listening to people that are more familiar with the company, know more than you, get up to speed, pass the credibility test that you know what's going on, and then start making the calls as the CEO. And then I think longer term, I go back to talent a lot, because if the most talented people rise to the top of the company, i.e. the people that the company believe are the most talented rise to the top of the company, talented people stay. If the politicians rise to the top of the company, if the power aggregators rise to the top, the most talented people leave. Well, it depends what talent we're talking about, but I like functional talent, technical talent, people who can do the job that works for clients. There are people that are incredibly good at the societal talents, right? The ability to tell stories, to influence people. That talent is important, but if directed in the right way to the benefit of the strategy and the client outcomes you're trying to deliver. But if the talent that's respected in the organization, that is already legitimized before your arrival, stays and grows, you've got a good chance. If you get rid of everybody and bring in a whole bunch of your mates, that's generally a failure. If you leave everybody that's in place, that's in there, you immediately cede power because you've come and you've changed nothing. So that becomes really important, that you send signals to the organization in terms of how you're going to operate as a CEO. Talent's going to win. The best ideas are going to win, no matter where they come from in the organization. Hierarchy is less important than you might imagine. Good ideas are more important. We care about ethics.
Such an important one. So we've talked about a lot of levers in the organization you could pull, Chris, and you've been very fulsome in your ideas and practices as well. One we've maybe not touched on so far is reward, and rewarding results, or rewarding the kind of behavior that you want to see in the new state organization. Yep. Is that an important one? Or
I think it's critically important. The reason I hesitate slightly when I say that to you is it's not a panacea for other things. Culture is more than reward.
Yep.
And so behaviors are much more important as a general topic, and you could see reward as one type of behavior. We as the leadership reward the following things. And so being clear on how people will be measured relative to the outcomes that you want, it also gives them clarity. So I think reward, first of all, is a signal in terms of where are we going? How do we get there? What do you need to help get us there? And that's what we'll pay for, because it's a signal that this is what matters. The other stuff doesn't. The second part I think is always important and often undercooked in reward systems is the ethics, the values, the culture. If you're not a culture carrier, particularly as a leader, you're not a culture carrier, or as a worker, you're not customer-centric, if we say that as a dimension, certainly for us currently is a huge dimension. If I'm not rewarding you for good customer outcomes and rewarding you less for bad customer outcomes, I'm not consistent in terms of who we want to be and how we want to face for clients. So I think that really, really matters. The work I'm doing right now, in part of some of the parts of the system I've now inherited, there's a type of malaise. It's not a high performing. So then you look at the reward structures and you go, actually, the rewards are too easy to get. And so base is too high. There's not enough incentivization. In the long term, we've not been generous in paying for people that take risks, commit sins of commission. We've tended to reward sins of omission, people who do less. So there's a bit of, the reward is then very helpful because it shocks the system a little bit. It says, there's a lot more money on the table for you if you do a lot more. So, awake out of your slumber, stop being so careful, start taking some risks, start getting us somewhere, start executing harder, start doing more. But reward in that sense for me is important in that it explains how much performance orientation you want. It links reward with things we're trying to do to deliver on strategy, and it links reward with elements of our culture and our values that we want to inculcate. And it's a very quick way to explain to people what you want. It's not sufficient, but it's a really big step short term. And then if everybody then leans in and continues to lead in the right way, then the culture starts to shift. But it is one of the ways that we lock you in place as a company. So if you slip back to the old ways of doing, your reward's going to fall. If the performance falls away, the rewards are going to fall. Because we're valuing certain things. So if we value risk awareness, and you demonstrate risk awareness, we need to give you a positive multiplier. And if you demonstrate lack of awareness of risk, or you're a bit casual or a bit sloppy, we need to hurt your reward. It happens once, and then you're suddenly wide awake. And you can decide how aggressively you want to calibrate that. But in the most aggressive on risk, you'd remove all the reward. And people would go, I didn't get any variable reward. And you go, yeah, you're lucky to have your base pay, because your risk alignment, your risk awareness is inadequate by our standards. And those type of messages really wake the whole company up that says, hey, these are really important things. But it's still a signal. You have to bring it to life, and you have to have the willingness to execute on that, because just putting the system in place and they're not running it properly also doesn't help.
No, indeed. But such an important lever when you want to wake up a sector as well.
Correct. I think sometimes it's as simple as you're underpaying on the sector. I can remember having conversations with folks in previous transformations, which is, there's a belief that we should pay at P50, so the 50th percentile in the market. And then you go, so you know that you're only getting third decile and fourth decile talent because all the, and then you have to have a way to guide the company through that says, well, do we need distinctive talent in every job? And the answer is no. But for the jobs that matter, the higher leverage jobs that wants to change, we better be paying P85, right? So that we get the best talent in the market.
With lots of upside.
Lots of upside. You don't have to pay P100, but then those people generally back themselves on the upside. And you get a different culture emerges from a long-term focus on, well, we'll just be average. And P50 says, we'll just be average. I think the other one that's as important is, when you use retention mechanisms, so as in equity or quasi-equity plans, and you make them unhurdled, the company goes to sleep. And all the senior people have unhurdled equity, which is every year that goes by, time is my only important thing. So the most important thing I need to do is keep my job. And so then I do nothing that puts my job at risk. I take no risks. I'm not courageous. I don't step into difficult conversations. I don't attack difficult problems. I take no risks at all, because my primary career strategy is now to keep my job. And then my unhurdled equity duly arrives, and because it's not hurdled, it's all mine. And in due course, if I stay long enough and I'm present at the day that it vests, I'll just take it. And then you go, well, that's, for me, immediately hurdle the equity straight away, because that's a very big signal. Then you go, all my general managers now have hurdled equity. Everybody goes, okay, the company valuation matters now. Not just keeping my job. Keeping my job is step one. Number two is make the company more valuable, or none of this reward arrives. So you see a lot of that are sort of historically there, and at some point they made sense.
Yeah.
And then again, before you change them, pause, take a breath, have a look whether that's the right change to make, reflect on it, talk to the board, talk to the owners, talk to the staff. And as soon as you've decided, go, get it in place. But it's a big signal.
Big signal. Now, you talked about not everybody deserves P85, 85th percentile. And then maybe that's a nice drip into another point, which is, of course, having a conversation around transformation without talking about the impact of AI.
Yep.
I guess we've seen huge headlines this week from Amazon, I think from Nestle, from Walmart as well, about starting to adjust and transform their populations based on technologies. What's your take on that? And whose breakfast is that eating?
I'm not sure that that's the right way to think about it, but it's clear that it's fundamentally going to change things. So if you go back to where I started, this thing called the internet had arrived and everybody was going, it won't matter. And then very quickly it mattered. Mm-hmm. And I remember working with one of my biggest clients going, it may not happen as fast as you think, but probably faster rather than slower, but it'll be more profound than you think. Because once the genie's out of the bottle and it keeps moving, the winners will be the ones that master the technology and the losers will be the ones that don't. And if you look at banks who continue to struggle are ones that don't have great digital assets, don't have great digital distribution because their customer service lags, because that's the wonderful thing about it. The other part is their economics lag. And so if you have better customer outcomes and better delivery economics, the chances are you can withstand more turbulence in your industry, you can withstand more change in your industry. And so I think AI for AI's sake is a little bit like digital for digital's sake. If you are displacing work to your customers, as we did in the early days of digital, that's unfortunate. And so when you put in an AI agent and it creates inadequate customer experiences, that's not a great outcome. Because yes, you may be lower cost in the short term, but you're lower quality in the short term, and that's maybe the right trade-off, but maybe not. And so you have to be a little bit thoughtful about how you deploy these, but you must deploy. You can't sit out. And so there's a bit of a rush. A lot of the work I did with Accenture over the last 18 months before taking this role is about how you think about AI strategically. How do you deploy it? And there's a lot of very interesting writing about how it changes certain job types, certain. But we talk a lot about Gen AI as a sort of interesting newer development. But we've been doing other forms of deterministic AI agents for a while now, where they do calculations for you. They are in that sense predictive, reliable, and they automate a lot of work. And so in the Deem case, we started with a whole floor of underwriters, and within 9 months we were down to 16 underwriters because you deployed different models, agents to think through the risk profiles. And then the role of the human beings becomes different. They don't process paper. They are not doing routine tasks. That's all left to the computers, who are more reliable and more predictable. And as a result, we have a system where the data is more consequent. And so we're able to learn faster. But you still have higher order work being done by people programming the agents, programming the algorithms, understanding whether it's working or not. So you get a lot of really interesting work that arises, but you build a system that people maintain rather than have people be the system. And I think the use of the technology gives, as a profound opportunity to redefine what we do, to be more valuable more generally as an industry, to be more predictable as an industry, easier to understand. But we have to be careful about not forgetting there's always a customer at the other end. The customer is an emotional person rather than anything else. I think the success of 2020 was, in the end, very, very simple. My partner at the time said, banks are like a rock in water. They block everything. They don't flow. And so you're just this monolith and people are banging up against it and it's not fun. So you need to be something softer, something more pliable, something more approachable. And while you think of digital as a technical thing, if you design really well, and we put a lot of premium on design, you recognize that I'm going to a customer group who come with very elevated emotional levels, particularly in the industry that I'm now in. People are showing up not on their worst day, that's already happened, but after their worst day, which is, what do I do now? And you have to lean in and help. So the most important vector for us is not efficiency, it's empathy. And the brand is built through empathy. So then the question is, when I'm deploying agents, which I must do because they give me better data, better predictability, better consequent management of an understanding, but I can't do it in a way that lacks empathy. And if you everywhere on social media, you see the disastrous outcomes of people deploying things without thinking about the customer experience. And there's rage out there because it feels like the company's not listening. And so that's the guideline that I put. I will always deploy. We will always experiment. We will learn as much as we can about these agents, but there's no reason to be the leader. You can be a fast follower. The most important part of followership is take the time to understand how this impacts the human beings in the system, the people that work for you, but more importantly, the people who you serve. And are you delivering experiences for them that are better because you've deployed the tech? Yeah. Not just leaner, cheaper, and so on.
It's such a great angle. The final part of our conversation is really returning back to the man or woman at the top who's leading the transformation, the transformer CEO. And I'm wondering, from your own experience and maybe from your knowledge of others, are you starting to see or feel some common DNA amongst transformer CEOs?
I would suggest, or I would postulate that all CEOs need to be, to a degree, transformational. I think the bit is not, if you calibrate how much transformation does a CEO need to bring to their role, 0 is always the wrong answer. The world is dynamic, it's changing. At minimum right now, if you aren't deeply curious and engaged in how AI is changing your industry and how it could change your business, you're missing an important change vector. But the world is changing. People's attitudes are changing. You've got new generations flowing through your business who have a different view on things. Particularly the demographics now, with boomers very quickly leaving the workforce, right? And younger people and the Gen X not quite having the same view on the world. It's changing what you do. So 0 is, for me, never the answer. And then the question is the degree of transformation that's needed. And I think there are people who are very interested in stasis, not moving. I always felt that if I had a conversation with the board and they said, well, we don't want to change anything, I always felt that was the wrong answer. And I would always argue, we have to change something. We have to keep moving forward. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind. But some franchises are incredibly powerful and some business models are incredibly rich and they throw off lots and lots of cash. And you don't necessarily need to innovate. But I think the mindset of one is make that an active choice rather than a passive choice. So this idea that a transformer CEO is unusual, I would suggest that if you aren't thinking about transformation, you shouldn't be a CEO. And if you choose not to change something, it's an active decision. I'm choosing not to touch this because, and the because needs to be profoundly important. Otherwise, you should be changing it. And that I think is really important. So I think it's that other half of the equation that's much more important. Why do people not transform? What is it? And to the extent that if I sit on a board or in part of a recruiting process, if I meet somebody that says, I'm going to come and change nothing, I would want to understand why. And I think it's the other half of the change of the process that needs a little bit more interrogation, because if you think like that, my fundamental belief is you underestimate the risk of doing nothing and you overestimate the risk of change. Change in of itself is better, because the systemic risk that we all run is that our businesses collapse because we aren't keeping up. And that is, for any company, the big existential risk. You become irrelevant, you become uncompetitive, and then to recover from that is extraordinarily difficult. So that's how I think about it. And so when I think about what you term transformer CEOs, it's people that come in, think in a very structured way about change. There are a lot of mercurial people who would badge themselves as transformers. I think you need to be careful about those things, because change for change's sake lacks the thoughtfulness that makes you successful. And often the people that are the most powerful change agents and CEOs, they kind of look boring. And they just go about it in a very structured, systemic way, but they know they have to change the company. All that they do is they choose not to pick a fight with the company while they change it. And I think that is really important. The subtlety of it, the thoughtfulness of it makes a big difference. So I think that is a really important thing about people who want to project themselves as transformers, is you got to come at this with some sophistication. It's not that headline grabbing. No, then you need to go find yourself a venture capital partner and go and disrupt the industry. But in my own experience, that doesn't always end well. And the number of disruptive companies that survive is quite low. People with brilliant franchise value, with a great marketplace, that are willing to change and innovate constantly are the real survivors and value creators in the world. We do get massive disruption, but even in our consciousness, how long did it take Tesla to become a brand we all understood? It's a decade-long journey. It wasn't quick. They worked at it systemically. They focused on the engineering. They did all the natural things that sometimes you forget that work was done.
Mm-hmm. So that's a fascinating angle, and I think if we pick up some of the themes that you talked about in your own profile, so the problem solving, the listening, this being thoughtful, as a CEO, are those things that you would see amongst the most successful CEOs who have a large brief to fulfill?
Yeah, I think curiosity is the one we haven't talked about, but part of what I value in my own experience, trained as a scientist, fine-tuned that at the Graduate School of McKinsey. I understand hypothesis-based problem solving. I'm willing to float things. I'm curious. I want to look for things. Then I look for the proof that my thoughts are correct, but always saying, how might we advance, right? What might we do differently? And being, in that sense, curious about alternative futures as opposed to comfortable with where we are. I think that's really important that everybody has. And a lot of what fuels that is curiosity. So why do we do it this way? What might be a different answer? How are other people doing it? And what am I missing? And that constant drive of curiosity, I think that's probably more powerful even than ambition, just curiosity, the willingness to think about it in a different way. Now, if you have some discipline around your curiosity, hypothesis driven is a way that I try to be disciplined about it. I just don't throw 1,000 things out there, but you've got to be curious the whole time because it grows your understanding of what you do. I think curiosity is massive in this, the willingness to ask questions, the willingness to be stupid. And I think you're terrible in this business if you think you have all the answers. So go back to it's more about listening. It's more about asking questions. It's more about being curious than saying, like, I have the answers. And I think if you come into a CEO role, I have all the answers, I know what then you better have them. And that, I think that is not necessarily the right path. Even if you have the answer, to dominate the company and say, I have all the answers, do what I say, that doesn't get you where you want to go because people don't follow you. And they don't have authorship. They don't have agency in this change, and it slips later. And you may be 100% right, and you've changed it, but you did it. They didn't. It's you versus the company as a whole. You haven't shifted everything. And so part of being curious, talking, being in the mix of the data, I always find the solutions are better. I learn an incredible amount from people around me. I'm happy to give authority to people in my environment. In that sense that if I'm not being curious, or stop me, if I'm moving too fast, stop me, in that sense, even how I manage the company is about giving other people a role in authoring the outcomes. And, we've had an incident overnight where someone's done something and then it's not clear what the answer is in response to that. One, can we do something? Well, let's be curious and go and look and set a whole lot of people to go and look, reconvene, get everybody to say, well, what do we think now? All right. And then I think I know the answer, but at that point, if I put it in the room too early, it means other people are not maximizing their contribution to the conversation. And I think that is what allows you to sustainably transform a company, as opposed to just do a project.
Indeed. So does that suggest between the kind of curiosity side, the kind of problem solving side, slightly more cerebral versus the leadership side, the influencing side, the taking the organization with you, that there's a kind of prioritization in your
I think if you can't find a good answer, it doesn't matter how much people believe in it, it's still a bad answer, right? So there is this need to design answers, and that requires curiosity, analysis. So those things are foundational. They just aren't sustainable if you haven't carried people with you. And sometimes the answers are in the social fabric of the company also. So, not everything's a hard mathematical answer. Sometimes there's a human resources lens to this. And so I try to turn that into fact as much as possible. So I love assessments, deep assessments, right? Let's call it technology of HR today is extremely sophisticated. We spent centuries understanding human beings and how they behave in the workplace. So you can rely on that as a foundational data richness in which they can build a successful company around that. So in that sense, we think of culture purely as a sort of emotional good, and it is, but it doesn't mean it's devoid of data, structure, techniques that you can use to get you where you want to go. I've in one of my last roles, we had an incredibly problematic leader who was constantly seen as disloyal, manipulative, aggressive. And then we did profiles on that individual, and we discovered that had very low capability in a particular area and tended to lean into areas that they were much more comfortable in, which weren't often the ones that they should have. But the areas of weakness were really around self-mastery and building relationships. And nobody had coached them to say, listen, you're now too senior to operate in that way. These are the areas you have to work on. You don't have to be excellent, but you have to be functional. And so then you would say, then you'd have two of those people and you'd put them in the room together, expecting them to solve the problem, but they neither have self-mastery or the ability to build relationships. And then they fail because their default will be to go to a conflict situation because they lack the skills. And then you go, well, maybe I want to keep this person because they're incredibly important in the delivery of the hard stuff. What do I need to do? And then you just build a different framework in which they can exist. In the short term, it meant that when they have to deal with other people, you need to put a third person in the room that does have the skills, that can bring the ideas together, a kind of facilitation. And so you change the structure of the team so that they are always in a kind of triangular situation where the content is winning and then their own lack of skill is growing and it's not derailing you. But there was this idea that this is a toxic personality. And the answer is no, it's a low skill personality. But because they're so spiky, you forget that there might be some skills that don't work. And that all comes out when you do the assessment. So you create data that allows you to work with executives who've been successful to date who need to make another jump. And then you say, this is what it is. And you help them understand it. They become self-aware. And then you can coach into that. Yeah. And they either succeed or fail. In this example I'm sharing with you, the executive went on to be very, very successful because this was just a blind spot. They'd come up the operations route. And in the operations route, you execute, and everybody needs to get out your way. And, you can always put the task ahead of the people. And you just had to go, at some point, that doesn't work anymore. And so even there, you can still bring it back to hard science. And I think, so the bias is always to try to program as much of your change into hard, fact-based stuff so that when you're making a decision, you stand on solid ground. And then the emotional wrapper is really important, but because you're building everything on facts, everything becomes more predictable. And so when I do performance and I do it on numbers largely and not on opinions, people can point to those numbers. And even if you add overlays, the foundational part is solid. The company then experiences that as predictable. They don't quite know why, but weird things are not happening anymore. And then everybody gets more comfortable and the top performers don't feel undermined, and the performers you're trying to coach up to a higher level understand what needs to be done. It all becomes a little bit more safe. And then the emotions turn to positive as opposed to negative because you remove stress. And so part of why I drive in that direction is, can I land as much as possible in a science-driven, fact-based way? Because it creates within a sort of a tone around how you lead, which can be extremely positive. There are all a lot of facts that flow through the company, and then everybody goes, well, that person's like that. And you go, no, but understand the profile. So it's like, I love Myers-Briggs because it's very easy to talk to people about. So why does that person not speak in meetings? And you go, well, start with the big I at the start of their Myers-Briggs. And why don't you adjust how you work so that you bring the best out of them? And then, great point. And so what starts to happen is the company becomes more proficient at these items, which are seen as, HR type stuff. But everybody needs to get better at them. And that's a lot of how you change the culture. You talk a lot about, so this is a value. Well, what does a value mean? Well, here's a set of behaviors that go with that. This is how I demonstrate those behaviors. And so when I'm rating you, I'm going, this is what I'm seeing. And they go, well, that's not my value. And you go, yes, but those are your behaviors. And so you can make it all a bit more predictable. So that, in that sense, to answer your question, it's much more technical. And I try to build the technical part of that as big as possible because it actually makes the other part much easier because you have greater foundational rest for everything that you do.
I hear you. Fantastic. That's great. So thinking about folks who follow in your footpaths, let's say they're sitting in an SVP role right now. and they're thinking, actually, my next role is CEO. My next role could be quite a transformational brief in that CEO-ship as well. What's your kind of advice to them? What's the couple of things that they really need to go sharpen, create a bit of a spike in, if they can, in the time they have?
Yeah, I think the way people should think through it is, why do you want the job? So I've always been very clear why I wanted the job. I wanted the job because I wanted to be able to orchestrate the change. I didn't want the job to be the CEO. But when you work with other people, at some point you have to go, I think I can do a better job. But you have to have a very honest conversation with yourself. And there are two parts. Do you want it? Because it's much easier to sit in the second chair. And it's very hard to sit in the first chair. And you have to, there's quite a lot of shift in how you behave, how you think about things when you're in the top chair. So the first question is, do you want the top job? And to answer that, you need to know, why do I want the top job? And so that's a sort of take a cold shower and check whether you really want it, because a lot of people arrive in the top chair and then realize it isn't what I thought it was. So if you're after hierarchical power, if you think that this is about ego, actually it's completely the opposite. You have more people to influence, you have to do more orchestration, you have to do more communication. And if you think your skill set, which is I direct activity better than the next guy, this is not going to help you as CEO. So the first thing is, do you want it, and why? The second thing is an honest assessment on whether you can. And I think that's where coaches become really important. I had an amazing coach just in the last 4 years who literally, we talked about what it would mean for me to be in the top job of this company or that company or that company. And are you prepared to make the changes to make you successful? And I think the second part is, are you capable? You need other people to help you understand that. Because I think if you're driving to become CEO, you start with the view that you are capable. And then sitting down with a coach to tell you the bad news that you've got a whole bunch of bad habits that you need to change is really important for you to assess. Because if you don't change them, you're not going to get a CEO job. You need to operate like a CEO. You need to look like a CEO. You need to behave like a CEO. You need to demonstrate the behavioral attributes that a good CEO has. And so if you don't know why you want the job, and if you miscalculate what the job really is, right, you won't develop the right skills. And if you have the right skills to arrive. So no board is going to give you the job unless they trust you, they feel safe with you, they feel that you are honest with them, that you explain things in a way that they can understand, that you go slow enough that they can keep up. Look, the reality of most boards is that they appoint management teams that are more capable than themselves. That's what they try to do all the time. And the management team always has more information than the board does. And then the board always has to go, am I getting the right answer from these people? Am I safe? Because particularly if you're in a listed company, being on the board is a horrible job because you can't do anything, but you're accountable for everything. There's only downside is sometimes when people think about it. It's a wonderful role, massively makes a massive contribution to the success of a company to have a great board. But if you want to be the CEO, you have to recognize that if you don't demonstrate those behavioral patterns that makes the board comfortable, because you're in the board, you don't work for them, you're on the board, you're in partnership with them. That's all different kinds of behaviors. And we come back to that permission to lead point, is people have to trust you in the role. And that means you have to show up in a different way than perhaps if you're a senior vice president or a chief level type person. The people that have the easiest jobs in corporate life are CFO, CRO, CPO, because they are very specific roles and they're the top of the tree. And they can be quite specific in operating from their vantage point, inputting that into the hybrid of the decision making. The CEO doesn't get to have a point of view. It has to pull it all together at the end of the day, and then has to explain it to a whole bunch of people. And before you go, I want the job, check that you really want that job, the one that a CEO really does. And then talk to people about whether do you have the skills and the thought patterns and the behavioral patterns that would make you very good at it.
So on both counts, bust the myths, bust the myths about the role.
Yep.
And bust the myths about yourself.
Yep.
And make sure we're really connecting and talking about the same thing.
Yeah, and I think the realization that having done this a couple of times now, it was very comfortable for me when I was the top technocrat in the company, or I was the most senior regulated person, or I ran one of the divisions. The bias was just to get stuff done, lead your team and so on. As you get into the roles I've had for the last decade or so, just carrying people forward, right? Sitting in meetings with them going, I know you don't like what I'm about to say, but I have to say it nonetheless. And then creating the time and, I guess, safe space for people to get through that and to arrive at a point where we're now ready to move. And then we talk about what we'll do next, and then explaining to why that will work. And then obviously having the technical capability with your team to go to where you said you would go. Because if you don't do that, then you fail. But it's the combination of those things that makes it for a good CEO. And CEO roles are, particularly if you're transforming a big company, they are a lot different from what you think they are, right? In large point, you become the chief storyteller of the new future you're trying to manifest and carrying everybody along with that. And it's a very different role than people think it is.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. So just a few I say quick questions. These are simple questions, but they potentially have huge answers. But I'm after kind of an instinctive response, if I may. So Transformer CEOs, born or bred?
Born, I think. But you can get it knocked out of you. And I think that the breeding part doesn't necessarily, if you're not curious, if you're not driven by change, if you don't like innovation and you seek safety, you're not going to take these risks because you're out on the tightrope without a safety net all of the time. And I think the bred part is if you get hurt too many times in the process, eventually you stop. And so that's much more a question of how you develop talent in allowing them to be bold, take risks, fail. I think modern corporate life doesn't allow failure very much. And so you've got to be, I've been very lucky in a position where I've been able to express my instincts in a safe environment where leaders have backed me, and I've made a lot of mistakes. And people have gone, did you learn something? Yes. Don't do it again. I say yes. and then we move forward. But sometimes if you're in the wrong environment, then the mistake
then that's it
can hurt you sometimes permanently, and then you stop.
And building on that, Transformer CEOs for one time or many?
It depends. I think true transformative personalities dislike stasis. And so they'll change it, it'll start looking great, and then they'll start saying, well, where are we vulnerable again? And then they'll go again. And sometimes you have a very dramatic transformation, like turning around a company, and then you need to readjust, and it's not quite as big. And some people don't like that. They love the adrenaline. Then they need to go something really big somewhere else. But often, if you really care about the set of customers you're serving, you really care about the company that you're running, you really care about the staff you're working with, and they follow you in constantly improving. I think that certainly that for me is how I like to see it. I always program everything as a 10-year journey. I don't think I've ever got to 10 years, but at least I have that inclination to, yes, a lot of the change in the beginning is hard because it's different from what we did before. And then how do you capture that and keep it with you as you move forward so you don't fall back into a kind of hubris that we've changed and so we're now the winner. As soon as you've changed and you think you're the winner, you should be paranoid again and start again. So my sense is they keep going as CEOs.
And Transformer CEOs in higher or lower demand in the next 5 years?
High. Always the world changing faster and faster and faster. I think particularly ones that have the right skill set. And I think it's the sort of unicorn in this space is somebody that's deeply technical, that understands how technology and particularly AI is changing the world, but also understands the human equation, knows how to look after the people, knows how to carry them forward. And I think we see more of the latter, people that are good at managing people.
Indeed.
And I think the message for everybody that really wants to transform businesses, if you aren't across the technicalities, right, and you can't tell whether what you're being sold is truth or lies, go back to school and start understanding the technology. Right now, you need to understand, if you're in banking, my success is all based on the fact that I understand how the tech stack works. I'm not a technologist, but I'm curious enough to know how it works, what the technical architecture is, what the logical architecture is, what the tension is between those two, how we program certain solutions, which ones are working, which ones are not. And I think you need to do the same with AI today. Understand the internet really well, but take time to invest in that if you want to be successful going forward, because you can hire yourself a good technologist and a good technology leader, but then they're effectively running the company, because if they can do both, then you're irrelevant, right? So if they understand the technology and they can run the human side of it, then why are you getting paid? And so you have to own those two pieces, otherwise you aren't going to get where you need to go.
Which is a very nice link to my final question, which is transformer CEOs, do they deserve a premium in terms of reward?
I don't think that's a logical question, in the sense that if you go and work for somebody, if you're a good transformer CEO, you're going to create massive amounts of value, as long as your board and your owners are sharing an appropriate level of value with you. You're going to do well. And I think transformer CEOs in general will earn higher levels so the premium is inherent in you doing a good job. I think where some modifications to that idea needs to be in place is that when a company is deeply underwater and it's just about getting it to survive, that's when the board needs to come in and go, we'll put money on the table, because just getting back to zero, i.e. we've survived, doesn't create enormous amounts of value. And so then it's quite demotivating for people, because they work really hard. Those are often harder transformations, and you've got to put some money on the table. And then I think more broadly, CEOs who sit on franchises and milk them are overpaid in general. And I think that we tend to reward chief executives for stability when change is needed. And so you see a lot of big franchises generally are drifting. So
rewarding stasis that you talked about
before. You're rewarding
before.
Stasis, and you're rewarding sins of omission. You are encouraging the CEOs to sit tight. And that, I think, again, requires an active decision by a board. If we're asking them to sit tight, why? What are we waiting for? Is there something else going on? And so sitting tight by itself is never an answer. You have to sit tight because we either need to do something else or we need to go somewhere else. And I've worked with the board. They were very clear. It didn't work for me. I didn't like the answer, but they were very clear. We have a bunch of remediation to do. It's going to take 3 years. You can't do any of that transformative stuff. This is what we need to do. The survival of the company depends on this, and this is all we're prepared to finance. And you go, fair enough. It's a clear decision. It's an active decision. And if you don't agree with it, go somewhere else.
Then you have a choice.
It's very clear. And it's worked out really well for them, because the stability of the company, the operating integrity of the company has gone way up, and the share price has gone way up. So good call. But for those people who want to change things constantly in the company, again, wrong time. Not wrong thing, just wrong time. Come back in 3 years' time. And sometimes timing doesn't work for you. In 3 years' time, you can go and you can create a whole new global business in 3 years, as opposed to just waiting. So in that sense, that's the part of the equation that I think needs adjusting, which is, if you make an active decision and you reward people correctly, then that's perfect. But sometimes we just let it drift, because we worry about our own ability to execute. And I think in general, risk aversion dominates in big companies as opposed to innovation. A big company that has great innovation will be a dominant company. If you find lots of attackers in your space bleeding you, there's lots of attackers in your space bleeding you. And you absorb that and then figure out what you need to do next.
Fantastic. Chris, I thought this was going to be a fantastic conversation, and it has been. And it reminds me of our time together a few years ago as well, which I remember fondly. So I want to say a massive thank you to you for taking the time out this week. And I know it's a critical week and lots happening and exciting new beginnings for you in Australia. So a big thank you from me. And of course, I wish you well with the next chapter.
Well, you're very kind. I hope it's been useful for the listeners. But always a pleasure to talk about how you change things, and good to catch up with you again.